Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. Before we get into this week's topic, I'd like to make some overarching observations. We are living in a time of national and moral decline. I don't think I needed to tell you that. But there are those who say people have always been sinners. The 21st century is no different than the 19th century. In a sense, that's true. But there are different dispensations of God. In the book of Judges, there were times when the people turned to the Lord and times when people again did evil in the sight of the Lord. There were 7 cycles over 350 years. In Kings and Chronicles, there were times when wicked kings ruled and Baal worship flourished. And there were times when good kings ruled and Jehovah worship was restored. There are Psalm 92:7 times when the wicked sprout up like grass, and all who do iniquity flourish. And there's Proverbs 29:2, times when the wicked are in authority. In 19th century America, there were genuine moral reforms. Hallucinogenic drugs, prostitution, gambling, abortion, slavery were all outlawed. Today, they're all returning. America's Christian heritage did make us a nation of righteous laws, a city set on a hill. You ask, well, what about those times in colonial America and in the Wild, Wild West? Well, in the early days of America's founding, even though there was this Christian base, America was still uncharted wilderness, a free-for-all. There wasn't the ability to police the rogues and the criminal element. Like in Judges 21, there was no king, there was no authority, so everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But once America was established, moral laws started to be written and enforced. This period in the 19th century was called the American Social Reform Movement. It's also called the Progressive Era, from 1890 to about 1920. When there was the shutting down of the gambling houses, the saloons, the prostitution, the organized crimes, the business hucksters, the stock cheaters, the snake oil salesmen, and the monopolies. If you were a Christian activist in 1905, the work came quite easy. You could walk into the State House, and there would be a welcoming legislature. It was a piece of cake to pass righteous biblical laws. All you had to do is tell your legislator or your governor this or that is a righteous thing to do, and this is what the churches want done. And the wind would be at your back. And the reason for this was that all of these social leaders at that time, all of the intelligentsia, were educated in Christian colleges. Even up until 1947, students at Rutgers University had to attend mandatory chapel every week. Now, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, unbelief and theological liberalism started to creep in, and so we could make a whole list of all of the secular intellectuals at this time. John Dewey, Horace Manning, Upton Sinclair, Margaret Sanger, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and the list goes on and on. And it was these people who turned the progressive movement into a humanistic, anti-God's law movement, ushering in the 20th century of secularism. But at the beginning, in the grassroots, the average citizen and the average legislator had a Christian worldview. Laws were not based upon human autonomy, but the law of nature and nature's God. But now, when a Christian activist walks into the State House, he's considered an anomaly, a throwback, an enemy of the state. The wind is now in your face. And the direction, the default position is towards Sodom. I've had New Jersey legislators tell me that religion and religious values have no place in government. Well, what happens when a society makes the shift from Christianity to humanism, from Jehovah worship to Baal worship? And of course, this shift doesn't happen overnight. It can take 2 or 3 generations. When this happens, there is going to be a pushback from the old guard. And they're called conservatives for a good reason. They want to conserve the Christian heritage. Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16, stand by the way and see, and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. Well, this pushback from the old guard is a good thing. This is how God tests and rewards his people. We don't do well unless there's a struggle. So in the 1970s, we had formed in America the Moral Majority, the Christian Coalition, Concerned Women for America, the Family Policy Council, the American Family Association, and many other activist and evangelistic groups, such as Campus Crusade, the Navigators, Young Life, InterVarsity. And if you think about it, they were all formed by people who were born in the 1920s, in the 1930s. They were raised on different values than those born in the 60s and the 70s. But soon that old guard starts to die off. And they go from being the moral majority to the moral minority. Just like Samson in the Old Testament, he didn't know that the Lord had departed from him and that his strength was gone. Judges chapter 16, verse 20. And when the Philistines came upon him, he thought he could shake them off as he did in times past. But he couldn't, because things had changed. Last week, there was an article entitled The Canadian Dilemma in a Nutshell by David Soloway, Canadian writer. And his summation was this. Even though there is an active group of blue-collar workers who want freedom, the trucker convoy, according to polls, the majority of Canadians, 2/3, are happy with the government totalitarianism. The vast majority of Canadians want to go along with the government. So the trucker protest cannot be defined as a popular uprising. What we're seeing is that small minority that fights to preserve freedom whenever a country begins to change values. Soloway writes, ironically, it's a popular opposition to a popular uprising that will determine the future of the country. This explains why, despite the courage and the exhilarating display of patriotic fervor animated by the trucker convoy, numbers of Canadians have left or consider leaving the country. I know of many such. They are not defectors, but long-suffering citizens who are convinced that they have read the writing on the wall. The issue then is clear, and the problem is obvious. The dilemma is that we may be witnessing the death of a nation. A compliant majority population, even more than a corrupt government elite, will determine whether a nation survives or not. The truckers are battling not only a prime minister who admires communist China and Castro's Cuba, but a majority citizenry that cares little for democratic freedoms and wishes only to get on with things as they were, fully vaccinated and content to go about masked and docile like a Costco herd of narcanized zombies, whatever that is. We might say that the truckers and their supporters are the vestiges of the old Canada, but they are an endangered species, a threatened minority. The mass of the country, the non-Canada in the traditional sense, Justin Trudeau's Canada, Doug Ford's Canada, and NDP leader Singh's Canada, is not behind them. It's a tragedy in the making, David Soloway, unquote. And to prove his point, a week after Soloway wrote this article, on Monday of this week, Canadian legislators voted to give Justin Trudeau emergency totalitarian power, an authority as a prime minister that had never been used before. And this was certainly unnecessary. The trucker convoy had already ended, and some of the mask and vaccine requirements were being dropped. But Trudeau and his leftist government want to find and prosecute the truckers. They want these emergency powers to enact revenge on their political opponents, like the Democrats have done to the January 6th protesters in Washington. The vote in the Canadian Parliament was 185 to 151 in favor of Trudeau's emergency powers. And eventually what happens in a country is that the left reaches a critical mass where they can outvote the right on every issue. When the Antichrist agenda takes over this world, it won't be because there's no opposition. I believe there's going to be great resistance, but it will be coming from a persecuted minority. The Antichrist agenda will flourish because most people will be complacent. And God will permit evil to take over the places of power, 2 Thessalonians 2:12, in order that they all be judged. So, all that we're seeing right now in the conservative movement against leftism is the pushback from the old guard that naturally occurs when evil begins to take over a country. And I'm really amazed by the intensity of activity among conservatives. Thousands of websites and news outlets. Now, not all of it's biblical. Much of it is wanting the fruit of Christianity, law and freedom, without realizing or fighting for the source, Christ and conversion. Most of the old guard is trying to stop the train wreck, but they fail in that they're trying to fix the fruit rather than the root. Now, I see the Christian responsibility in all this is not to jump on the Save America bandwagon, but to use the culture war to win people to Christ as people start to see evil arise. This gives us a great opportunity to teach people that the world is passing away and salvation is found in Christ and his coming kingdom. Now, in the time I have left, I want to talk about the recent legalization of sports betting. This is just one more example of America's moral decline. This is an example of the takeover by the ungodly. Let's first look at the history of gambling in America. In colonial America, gambling was illegal in those colonies that were formed to be Christian communities, such as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded by the Puritans, and Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers. Cards, dice, gambling tables were illegal, just like drug paraphernalia is illegal today, because those items had no use outside of gambling. But lotteries became very popular in many other colonies to raise money for public projects. Some of the Ivy League colleges in America were started with lottery money. Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia was built with lottery money. And the founders tried to fund the Revolutionary War with a lottery. A private lottery was used by Congress in 1823 to raise money to beautify Washington, but the organizers stole the money. So people will always be greedy. People will always give to get. As the population in America grew and moved west, most of the gambling was in the new territories. New Orleans and the lower Mississippi Valley allowed casino gambling because of the French and the Spanish influence in those areas. These cultures did not have the biblical Protestant teaching against gambling. By the 1830s, social leaders began to see that gambling was limiting economic growth, turning these cities into centers of laziness and crime, debasing the morals of society. Temperance and anti-gambling groups arose, and there was legislation against gambling. By the 1840s, most states banned lotteries. Then came the gold rush from 1849 to 1855. Gambling started back up in these new western states. Then after Civil War, more laws were passed. By 1910, all forms of gambling were pretty much prohibited in the United States, except for a few pockets of horse racing. Arizona and New Mexico had to outlaw gambling in order to become states. the gambling in America really began to be outlawed once the negative effects of gambling started to enact a price on society. But that alone would not have outlawed gambling without the religious revivals that were taking place also at this time. In the 1930s, gambling started back up again. In 1931, Massachusetts decriminalized bingo in Catholic churches. And in 1931, Nevada legalized gambling for tourism. And the excuse for legalized gambling was to control it, since it was happening anyway, supposedly to also reduce the criminal element and to raise revenue for the state. In 1978, New Jersey legalized gambling in Atlantic City with the excuse of revitalizing the area and to fund education. That's a lie. The joke is Atlantic City used to be a slum by the sea. Now it's a slum by the sea with casinos. Through the 80s and 90s, states started creating state lotteries because states were greedy for more money, and now only 5 states in the union don't have lotteries. So the legalization of what was once illegal and immoral is a great condemnation upon our current generation. This generation is saying that the moral reforms of the past were wrong, and woe to those who remove the ancient landmarks. It was by Christian truth that our nation did away with gambling. But as America has abandoned Christianity, all of a sudden, legislators and the public are beginning to think gambling would be a good thing. It's inevitable. If there's no God, everything's permissible, like abortion, transgenderism, homosexuality, and of course, gambling. Because of the abandonment of God's law, I really believe that someday our nation is actually going to have forms of slavery again. Because there can't be freedom without a pervasive Christian worldview. Slavery is systemic to atheism. Economic and social freedom doesn't exist in humanism. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast in liberty, in which Christ has set us free. So it was in 2018 that the Supreme Court legalized sports betting, striking down the federal ban on state-authorized sports betting. Most of us missed that case, Murphy versus National Collegiate Athletic Association. It was brought by the governor of the state of New Jersey, Phil Murphy. So he's the man who now has this on his legacy. Chris Christie was the original plaintiff. And the court ruled 7-2 in favor of sports betting, with even the conservative justices Alito, Clarence Thomas, and Neil Gorsuch voting in favor. And the reason? States' rights. Non-biblical conservatism makes the error of thinking conservatism is all about giving people freedom, rather than following the higher law of God. Remember, slavery was also defended as a matter of states' rights. But Lincoln argued that it was a matter of right and wrong, the higher law of God, regardless of states' rights. So beware of constitutional conservatism that is not based on God's law, because being based on human freedom, in the end, it will lead to the same immorality as leftism. The irony is that the 2 liberal judges, Ginsburg and Sotomayor, wrote the dissenting opinion, arguing that legal precedent was ignored and the ruling was merely based upon a desire to legalize sports betting, which is true. So after that ruling, online betting companies went into action. FanDuel, DraftKings, Caesars Sportsbook, all exploded. And I'm sure you've noticed all of the commercials for sports betting. Millions are being spent on ads. And these gambling houses are giving new subscribers free money to get them started. Like a drug dealer gives out free heroin to get people hooked. And it's really discouraging to see America go into such deep depravity. Remember back in the 1980s, the Back to the Future movies with Michael J. Fox? In one of the sequels, Biff, the antagonist of the story, gets his hands on a sports record book from the future. And when Marty McFly goes to the future, Biff has turned Hill Valley into a sports betting casino town. Sleazy, gang-infested, poverty, drugs, profanity, violence. Biff has made millions, and he has a casino in the middle of the town called Pleasure Paradise. By the way, Tom Wilson, who played the part of Biff in real life, is a born-again Christian. But my point is that 40 years ago, even Hollywood depicted sports betting as producing an environment that is sleazy and immoral. No one sees it that way today. All sorts of vices are considered normal, even wholesome. Now, on the surface right now, sports betting will increase the popularity of sports. Billions of more dollars will go into sports. And everyone is talking about how games are now more exciting when bets are placed on games. And that's true. Just the pride of having your team win is not enough. The greed of winning money adds to the excitement. Here's one testimonial. It makes the game a lot more interesting to watch because you feel like you're part of something. You're not just sitting there watching like a spectator. The excitement of waiting for the outcome is an adrenaline rush. Well, of course. It's the thrill of gambling mixed in with the thrill of sports. So, although it appears as if there's going to be some short-term gains due to sports betting, and the politicians will be getting more tax revenues, in the long term, any wholesomeness left in sports is going to be gone, and it will become like Biff's Pleasure Paradise. Gambling has a debilitating effect on a nation's psyche and on people's work ethic. In Louisiana, gambling has replaced the oil and gas industry as the number one revenue generator for the state's budget. And that's the sin of gambling. It doesn't produce any real wealth. It only funds a whole class of people who freeload off of other people's greed. It is definitely the prophecy of Deuteronomy 29, where the ungodly person, by his ungodliness, turns the well-watered land into a desert. Deuteronomy 29:18, a root bearing poisonous fruit and wormwood. It shall be when he hears the words of this curse, that he will boast, saying, I have peace, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart, in order to destroy the watered land with the dry. So this person who ignores the law of God and brings sin into the nation begins like a poisonous seedling, but eventually produces all sorts of evil fruit. And it's amazing that the scripture points out here that this evil doer begins thinking that everything's just fine. I have my sin legalized. The nation's economy is fine. The roads look good. There's peace in the land. God is not sending lightning down from heaven to strike me. The nation hasn't turned into some sort of Mad Max dystopian future. So he thinks everything's okay. But actually, over time, he is destroying the nation. He is turning it into a moral and spiritual and physical desert. You know, the reason we even have wealth today to gamble in the first place is because it was built up by God-centered, hard-working people. But rather than being a producer, the gambler lives as a parasite off of the capital built up by others. Now, in one sense, it's easy to relish the fact that the punishment for gambling is built into the crime. The fool is easily parted from his money. So if the ungodly want to throw away their money, so be it. It's an apt punishment for those who forsake the Lord. As the prophet Jeremiah wrote, your own wickedness will correct you, and your apostasies will reprove you. Or as the prophet Isaiah writes in Isaiah 3:11, woe to the wicked, for it will go badly with him, for what he deserves will be done to him. But the gambler hurts everyone. Romans 14:7, for not one of us lives to himself, and not one dies for himself. I like to illustrate the theft of gambling this way. Let's play a game. 100 people give me $1 for a chance to win $90. Based on a randomly generated number, I make $10 and I give out $90. I get to siphon from the public $10 for doing nothing, and it's a great racket. The players are gradually relieved of their money by a crook, but they don't see it because they're blinded by the possibility of winning. Now, the error in such a game with only 100 people can easily be seen, but multiply it by millions of people in the lottery or in sports betting, and the numbers begin to confuse most people. Gambling is stealing by deception. I remember one of my graduate professors in statistics sharing with the class that the lottery is a fool's game. The majority of people are fooled because they don't understand probability in mathematics. It's too much for the average mind to comprehend. People actually think they can win if the odds are 1,000,000 to 1. After all, somebody has to win. But mathematically, the odds of 1,000,000 to 1 are really 0. Rationally, one should realize a winning event will never take place for you. In sports gambling, the odds are still always in favor of the house, but the gambler is deceived into thinking he has insider knowledge into the sport, and therefore he has an advantage over the house. But nobody can predict the future. That's why the bookies always win. A psychologist friend of mine sent me this article about the dopamine rush that motivates gambling behavior. And he also wrote this comment: sports betting, unlike games of chance, seem all the more under the influence of the bettor's expertise in making a smart selection. Of course, it's an illusion. Gambling is a fool's game, and there's no shortage of fools in the world. As P.T. Barnum once said, there's a sucker born every minute. The lottery and gambling is a tax on stupid people. I hate to be so blunt, but it's the truth. And that's why when America was having Christian revivals, gambling was outlawed, to prevent there from being a leisure class of do-nothing gambling bosses and to protect unlearned people from being taken advantage of. Plus, in gambling, there's not only the cost of gambling, there's the opportunity cost. That $200 that was wasted on gambling would have been spent on something more productive: housing, food, clothing, furniture. Gambling siphons good money off of a society, and it wastes it on those who produce nothing of value. Unless you're like the world and you think the entertainment adrenaline rush of gambling is a good product. So what does the Bible have to say about gambling? Let me list some verses here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 7. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example, because we did not act in an undisciplined manner among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with labor and hardship we kept working night and day, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. 1 Thessalonians 4:11, to make it your own ambition to lead a quiet life and to attend to your own business and to work with your hands, just as we commanded you. Jeremiah 17:11, as a partridge that hatches eggs which has not laid, so is he who makes a fortune, but unjustly. In the midst of his days it will forsake him, and in the end he will be a fool. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 6, will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuation against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? Ephesians 5:11, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. And I mentioned that verse because it's not just about our own personal holiness, but also about not supporting others in their corrupt occupations. Don't give a bottle of vodka to a drunkard. Ephesians 4:28, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need. Proverbs 13:11, wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it. And 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10. Swindlers will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's not the word for thievery. In fact, the word thievery is mentioned earlier in the verse. But this is one who by deception and temptation to greed cheats people out of their money. The very definition of the gambling industry. Well, we see in all of these verses the Christian work ethic. That God's people are called to supply legitimate goods and services. We're not called to take money from other people by games of chance. But you say none of those texts mention the word gambling. Well, the Bible doesn't mention the word heroin or transgenderism or abortion, yet the biblical moral teaching is still clear. Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, verse 15, beware of every form of covetousness. And gambling is a form of covetousness. Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 6, for the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. Gambling is one of those evils. Here's a list I shared 10 years ago when I did a program about gambling. First, gambling violates God's divine established means of gaining wealth. 2, gambling is motivated by greed, not charity. 3, gambling is a lack of trust in God's provision. 4, gambling breeds discontent in a nation. 5, gambling funds an industry that promotes other vices. 6, gambling destroys families and takes money away from legitimate businesses. 7, gambling exploits the poor and uneducated. Number 8, gambling undermines the work ethic and sets a bad example. And number 9, gambling is addictive. So this is obvious to basic Christian living. But there's hardly a word against gambling coming from conservative pundits. Even Clay Travis and Buck Sexton talk about placing sports bets and going to casinos. I mean, after all, the last Republican president, President Trump, made his fortune by building casinos. And there are many other evils in our society. Gambling seems like the least of our problems. But it's really not. With government deficit spending because of greed, with people wanting socialism, government jobs, and entitlements because of greed, and with Americans turning to gambling out of greed, it's going to make for a perfect economic storm. My concern is first with the Christian community, that we don't become conformed to this world in a tolerance toward gambling. A friend of mine was disturbed by the Christian golfer Jordan Spieth becoming a partner with FanDuel, but we're seeing this everywhere. Many professing Christians are getting into sports betting. This is because they don't know the Word of God. Romans chapter 12, they're conformed to this world rather than being renewed in the spirit of their mind by the Word. In a World Magazine article, it reports that sports betting has become a real problem on Christian college campuses. At the Southern Baptist College Baylor, they have a gambling addiction recovery program. Quote, no longer are players forced to make public entrances into casinos. Now they can roll a dice with the privacy of a touchscreen anytime, day or night. With phones, you have 10 million prostitutes in your pocket. Now you have 10,000 bookies too. It's the enemy's way of taking our focus off of who we are, who God made us to be, and it's just evil. Here's a quote from a counselor at Baylor. It's naive to think gambling isn't a problem just because some administrators and pastors aren't addressing it. Well, I'm addressing it now, and it is increasingly becoming a great problem. Like many sins, they're legalized because people forget why they were made illegal in the first place. And they're legalized because people aren't serious about the moral law of God and the Word of God. In conclusion, I'm not speaking against sports betting as if getting rid of gambling is going to fix America. Like straightening up the chairs on the deck of the Titanic is going to keep her from sinking. Gambling is a symptom of a greater spiritual problem. Relieving the symptoms is not the goal. Although I would be happy to see, sports betting made illegal. The sports betting phenomenon really shows a much deeper spiritual problem. To turn our nation away from the scourge of gambling would take systemic changes. God and His Word must be honored again and returned to the public square. And without those systemic changes, gambling is inevitable, like the inevitability of legalized drugs and prostitution and abortion and transgenderism and no jail for crimes and open borders. There will be no end to the lawlessness to come, because without God, all things are permissible. And that's why we need personal salvation. As the Apostle Peter preached in the book of Acts, be saved from this perverse generation and find in Christ our hope, our future, our inheritance, our wealth, His salvation, and His coming kingdom. Acts 26:18, to turn from darkness to light and from the dominion of Satan to God, that we may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in Christ. Have you made that turn? Thanks for listening. As always, to help the cause, subscribe on YouTube or Rumble. Like, share, leave a comment below. And may Jesus Christ reign.